There exists a profound truth about human suffering that most people never discover, a secret that Carl Jung spent his entire life uncovering through his revolutionary exploration of the human psyche. Every ache in your soul, every emotional wound that refuses to heal, every moment of inexplicable sadness or overwhelming anxiety carries within it a hidden spiritual message. This isn't just poetic metaphor or wishful thinking. Jung discovered that what we call psychological pain is actually the language of transformation itself, speaking to us in the only way it knows how. Most people experience inner pain as something to be avoided, medicated, or pushed away as quickly as possible. They see emotional suffering as evidence that something is wrong with them, that they're broken or defective in some fundamental way. But Jung's revolutionary insight revealed something extraordinary. Inner pain is not your enemy. It's not a sign of weakness or failure. It's actually your psyche's most sophisticated method of communication, attempting to guide you toward the very experiences and insights you need for spiritual growth and authentic self-realization. When Jung explored the depths of human consciousness, he discovered that every form of psychological suffering contains what he called a numinous quality, a sacred dimension that connects us to something far greater than our individual concerns. He realized that pain, when understood correctly, becomes a doorway to transcendence, a pathway to discovering aspects of yourself that remain hidden during comfortable, unconscious living. This understanding has the power to completely transform your relationship with suffering. Instead of seeing difficult emotions as obstacles to overcome, you begin to recognize them as invitations to explore deeper territories of your being. Instead of running from psychological pain, you learn to listen to its wisdom, to decode its messages, and to allow it to guide you toward the spiritual awakening that your soul has been seeking. Before we explore these life-changing insights that have guided countless individuals toward profound healing and spiritual transformation, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications if you value deep spiritual wisdom over surface-level comfort. This channel is dedicated to exploring the profound truths that can genuinely revolutionize how you experience your inner world and connect with the sacred dimensions of human existence. Now let's discover what Carl Jung understood about the secret spiritual meaning hidden within every form of inner pain, and how recognizing this meaning can transform your deepest wounds into your greatest sources of wisdom and spiritual power. Carl Jung's understanding of inner pain begins with his revolutionary concept of the collective unconscious, a deeper layer of the psyche that connects individual experience to universal spiritual patterns. When you experience psychological suffering, you're not just dealing with personal problems or individual dysfunction. You're actually encountering archetypal energies that have been guiding human spiritual development for millennia. These archetypal forces speak through pain because they're attempting to initiate you into deeper levels of consciousness and authentic spiritual maturity. Jung discovered that every form of inner pain corresponds to what he called a spiritual crisis, a moment when your current level of consciousness can no longer contain the growth that your soul is demanding. The anxiety you feel when facing major life transitions isn't just nervousness about change. It's the birth pangs of a new level of spiritual awareness trying to emerge through your consciousness. The depression that seems to descend without apparent cause isn't simply a chemical imbalance. It's often your psyche's way of forcing you to descend into the underworld of your own being, where the treasures of authentic selfhood are hidden. Modern research has begun to validate Jung's insights about the spiritual dimensions of psychological pain. Studies show that individuals who learn to find meaning in their suffering demonstrate increased resilience, enhanced spiritual awareness, and greater capacity for what researchers call post-traumatic growth. This isn't just psychological healing, it's spiritual transformation that uses pain as the catalyst for unprecedented personal evolution. Jung's concept of the shadow becomes particularly relevant when understanding the spiritual meaning of inner pain. The shadow represents all the aspects of yourself that you've rejected, denied, or hidden because they didn't fit your conscious self-image or spiritual ideals. But Jung discovered that the shadow contains not just negative qualities, but also tremendous spiritual potential that has been suppressed or misunderstood. When you experience inner pain, it's often because shadow material is trying to surface, demanding integration into your conscious spiritual life. The spiritual pain of feeling disconnected, alone, or fundamentally flawed often signals that you've been rejecting aspects of your authentic spiritual nature. Perhaps you've been trying to be more spiritual than you actually are, suppressing your genuine emotions, desires, or human needs in pursuit of some idealized version of enlightenment. The pain you feel is your psyche's rebellion against this spiritual inauthenticity, calling you back to a more honest, integrated relationship with your complete spiritual nature. Jung observed that spiritual traditions throughout history have recognized pain as a sacred initiatory experience. The mystics spoke of the dark night of the soul. Shamanic traditions include deliberate suffering as part of spiritual training, and wisdom traditions across cultures acknowledge that genuine spiritual growth requires what Jung called conscious suffering, the willingness to experience pain without running away, while maintaining awareness of its deeper spiritual significance. This conscious suffering is qualitatively different from unconscious pain that simply overwhelms and destroys. Conscious suffering involves maintaining what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold paradox and find meaning in apparent contradiction. When you can experience pain while simultaneously recognizing its spiritual purpose, the suffering itself becomes transformed from mere agony into sacred experience that facilitates genuine spiritual development. Jung's understanding of complexes provides another key to decoding the spiritual meaning of inner pain. Complexes are autonomous clusters of psychological energy that form around significant emotional experiences, particularly those involving spiritual themes like meaning, purpose, death, and transcendence. When you experience persistent inner pain around these themes, it often indicates that a spiritual complex has been activated, demanding conscious attention and integration. The complex around spiritual unworthiness might manifest as chronic shame, self-criticism, or the feeling that you're fundamentally flawed or undeserving of love and happiness. But Jung discovered that beneath this painful complex lies a profound spiritual truth. You're experiencing the natural human response to recognizing the vast gap between your current level of consciousness and your soul's potential for spiritual realization. The pain isn't punishment, it's motivation, calling you toward the spiritual work necessary to bridge that gap. Jung's concept of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming who you truly are, becomes essential for understanding pain's spiritual meaning. Individuation requires what Jung called the sacrifice of the ego, the willingness to release limited identities and comfortable but inauthentic ways of being in service of your deeper spiritual nature. This sacrifice is often experienced as loss, grief, and existential anxiety because the ego experiences any expansion of consciousness as a kind of death. The spiritual pain of feeling lost, directionless, or without clear purpose often signals that you're in the midst of an individuation crisis. Your old identity, your familiar ways of understanding yourself and your place in the world are being outgrown by your expanding spiritual awareness. The discomfort you feel isn't evidence that something is wrong. It's evidence that something profoundly right is trying to happen, even though it requires the death of who you used to be. Jung's understanding of synchronicity, meaningful coincidences that seem to arise from beyond ordinary causation, also relates to the spiritual meaning of inner pain. He observed that periods of intense psychological suffering often coincide with increased synchronistic experiences, as if the universe itself were responding to your inner spiritual crisis with precisely the guidance and support needed for growth. The pain opens you to perceiving connections and meanings that remain invisible during more comfortable periods of life. These synchronicities often appear as books that address your exact spiritual questions, conversations that provide crucial insights, or opportunities that point toward your next stage of spiritual development. Jung understood these meaningful coincidences as evidence that individual spiritual crises are connected to larger patterns of cosmic meaning and purpose. Your personal pain becomes a doorway through which universal spiritual wisdom can enter your conscious awareness. The concept of the wounded healer is perhaps Jung's most profound insight about the spiritual meaning of pain. He recognized that individuals who have consciously worked through their own spiritual crises often develop extraordinary capacity for guiding others through similar territories. The pain that once felt like pure suffering becomes transformed into spiritual authority and healing power that can serve others who are navigating comparable challenges. This transformation doesn't eliminate the original wound or make the pain irrelevant. Instead, it integrates the wound into a larger spiritual identity that includes both suffering and healing, brokenness and wholeness, human limitation and transcendent possibility. The wounded healer embodies the spiritual truth that authentic power emerges not from avoiding pain, but from learning to transform it into wisdom and compassion. Jung observed that many forms of inner pain carry specifically religious or spiritual dimensions that connect individual suffering to universal human experiences of the sacred. The pain of feeling abandoned by God, questioning the meaning of existence, or struggling with mortality and impermanence represents encounters with what Jung called the God archetype, the psyche's innate drive toward connection with transcendent reality. These spiritual crises often feel more intense and disorienting than ordinary psychological problems because they involve fundamental questions about the nature of reality, the meaning of life, and your place in the cosmic order. But Jung understood these painful spiritual questionings as evidence of spiritual health rather than pathology. They indicate that your consciousness is expanding beyond conventional religious answers and seeking authentic spiritual understanding based on direct experience rather than inherited beliefs. The dark emotions that often accompany spiritual seeking, doubt, despair, anger at God, existential anxiety, serve important spiritual functions. They strip away superficial spiritual identities and comfortable religious assumptions, forcing you to encounter the sacred in its raw, unfiltered form. This direct encounter with transcendent reality is often initially destabilizing and painful because it reveals the inadequacy of your previous spiritual understanding. Jung's approach to dreams becomes particularly relevant for understanding the spiritual meaning of inner pain. He observed that periods of intense psychological suffering often produce dreams with powerful spiritual symbolism, death and rebirth, encounters with divine figures, journeys through symbolic landscapes that mirror the soul's spiritual development. These dreams don't just reflect your psychological state, they provide guidance for navigating the spiritual transformation that your pain is facilitating. Dream imagery during spiritual crises often includes archetypal symbols that appear in mystical traditions worldwide: the cross, the mountain, the cave, the tree, the river, the bridge. Jung understood these symbols as expressions of the collective unconscious, attempting to provide spiritual guidance during times when ordinary consciousness feels inadequate for the challenges you're facing. Your personal pain becomes connected to universal spiritual patterns that have guided human development throughout history. The practice of what Jung called active imagination, engaging consciously with unconscious contents through dialogue, visualization, or creative expression, becomes essential for transforming pain into spiritual wisdom. Instead of simply enduring painful emotions or trying to eliminate them, you learn to engage with them as spiritual teachers that carry important messages about your soul's development. This might involve imagining conversations with the part of you that feels wounded, creating art that expresses your spiritual struggles, or writing letters to God about your pain and confusion. The goal isn't to make the pain disappear, but to establish conscious relationship with it, allowing its spiritual wisdom to emerge through creative expression and inner dialogue. Jung discovered that pain often serves as what he called a transcendent function, creating new possibilities by bridging opposing aspects of your spiritual nature. The tension between your human limitations and spiritual aspirations, between your desire for comfort and your need for growth, between your fear of change and your longing for transformation, generates creative energy that can give birth to unprecedented spiritual insights and capabilities. This transcendent function operates through what Jung called the tension of opposites. Instead of trying to resolve spiritual contradictions quickly or eliminate uncomfortable paradoxes, you learn to hold them consciously, allowing their creative tension to generate new spiritual possibilities that honor both sides of the apparent conflict. This capacity to embrace spiritual paradox becomes a source of tremendous wisdom and resilience. The alchemical traditions that fascinated Jung throughout his life provide powerful metaphors for understanding pain's spiritual significance. Alchemists spoke of the nigredo or blackening phase, where base materials are broken down and purified through heat and pressure. Jung recognized psychological and spiritual pain as serving a similar function, breaking down false identities and superficial spiritual understanding to reveal the authentic spiritual gold hidden within. This alchemical perspective transforms your relationship with suffering from victimhood to collaboration with natural spiritual processes. Instead of asking, "Why is this happening to me?" you begin to ask, "What is this experience trying to teach me? What aspect of my spiritual nature is trying to emerge through this difficulty?" This shift in perspective activates what Jung called the religious attitude, a stance of reverence toward life's processes that recognizes the sacred dimension present even in painful experiences. Jung's understanding of the anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, also relates to the spiritual meaning of inner pain. These archetypal figures often appear during spiritual crises as inner guides who can help navigate the complex territory between human limitation and spiritual transcendence. The anima might appear in dreams or active imagination as a wise woman who offers comfort and guidance during dark spiritual passages. The animus might manifest as an inner spiritual warrior who provides strength and determination for facing spiritual challenges. Pain involving relationships, creativity, or emotional expression often signals that anima or animus energies need conscious attention and integration. The spiritual anguish of feeling cut off from your creative potential, unable to express your authentic emotions, or incapable of deep intimacy may indicate that these archetypal functions require development as part of your spiritual maturation. The phenomenon of spiritual emergence, recognized by transpersonal psychology as a natural but challenging process of consciousness expansion, often involves what Jung would recognize as archetypal pain. As your awareness expands beyond conventional boundaries, you may experience disorientation, depression, anxiety, or existential crisis, not because something is wrong, but because your consciousness is outgrowing its previous limitations. Jung observed that spiritual development rarely proceeds smoothly or predictably. There are periods of regression, apparent setbacks, and times when spiritual insights seem to disappear entirely. These difficult phases serve important functions. They test the authenticity of your spiritual understanding, force deeper integration of spiritual insights into daily life, and prevent spiritual inflation or premature claims to enlightenment. The spiritual meaning of relational pain deserves particular attention in Jung's framework. The agony of betrayal, abandonment, rejection, or loss in relationships often carries profound spiritual significance beyond the immediate emotional hurt. These experiences force you to confront fundamental questions about love, trust, forgiveness, and the nature of human connection that are essentially spiritual rather than merely psychological. Jung recognized that relationship difficulties often mirror internal spiritual dynamics. The person who abandons you externally might represent an aspect of yourself that you've been abandoning internally. The criticism you receive from others might reflect your own inner critic that prevents spiritual self-acceptance. The love you seek from others might point toward the self-love and divine connection that your soul ultimately requires for spiritual fulfillment. Understanding relational pain as spiritual curriculum transforms victim consciousness into spiritual empowerment. Instead of focusing solely on what others have done to you, you begin to explore what these experiences are teaching you about your own spiritual development. This doesn't mean excusing harmful behavior or avoiding necessary boundaries, but rather recognizing that every relationship serves your soul's evolution in ways that may not be immediately apparent. Jung's concept of the self with a capital S represents the archetype of wholeness and spiritual realization that serves as the organizing principle of the entire personality. Many forms of inner pain arise from the tension between your current level of development and the self's drive toward spiritual completion. The dissatisfaction, restlessness, and yearning that characterize so much human experience reflect the self's constant invitation to transcend limited identities and realize your full spiritual potential. This tension between ego and self is experienced as spiritual pain because it involves recognizing the inadequacy of everything you've previously relied upon for identity and security. Your accomplishments, relationships, beliefs, and self-concepts all prove insufficient to satisfy the self's demand for authentic spiritual realization. This recognition can be devastating to the ego, but it's essential for genuine spiritual development. The process Jung called circumambulation of the self involves gradually spiraling closer to authentic spiritual identity through repeated encounters with limitations, failures, and painful recognitions of where you've been living inauthentically. Each spiral brings you closer to the center of your being, but the journey often involves considerable spiritual pain as false identities are stripped away layer by layer. Jung's understanding of projection provides another key to decoding pain's spiritual meaning. Much of what we experience as inner pain actually involves projecting aspects of our own spiritual nature onto external circumstances or other people. The pain of feeling unloved might reflect your failure to develop spiritual self-love. The anguish of feeling meaningless might indicate that you've been seeking spiritual purpose in external achievements rather than inner realization. Withdrawing these projections and recognizing that what you seek externally must first be developed internally represents a crucial stage of spiritual development. This process is often painful because it requires taking responsibility for your own spiritual life rather than expecting others or external circumstances to provide what only inner work can deliver. The spiritual pain of disillusionment serves an essential function in Jung's understanding. When your spiritual projections are withdrawn, when your idealized images of teachers, partners, or spiritual paths reveal their limitations, you're forced to develop authentic, rather than projected relationship with the sacred. This disillusionment, while painful, clears the way for genuine spiritual experience based on direct encounter, rather than wishful thinking or fantasy. Jung observed that crisis periods often activate what he called the religious function of the psyche, an innate drive toward meaning, purpose, and connection with transcendent reality. Even individuals who consider themselves non-religious or anti-spiritual often find themselves drawn to spiritual questions and experiences during times of intense inner pain. The crisis breaks down rational defenses and opens awareness to dimensions of experience that remain hidden during ordinary consciousness. This activation of the religious function doesn't necessarily lead to conventional religious belief or practice. Instead, it opens you to what Jung called immediate religious experience, direct encounter with the sacred that bypasses institutional mediation. The pain that initially feels like spiritual abandonment often becomes the doorway through which authentic spiritual connection emerges. The integration of pain's spiritual meaning requires what Jung called symbolic attitude, the capacity to recognize that psychological experiences often carry meanings beyond their literal content. Physical symptoms, emotional reactions, relationship patterns, and life circumstances all become potential symbols through which spiritual wisdom attempts to communicate. Developing this symbolic perspective transforms your entire relationship with difficult experience. Instead of taking everything at face value, you begin to ask what deeper spiritual truth might be seeking expression through surface appearances. The chronic illness becomes a symbol of spiritual healing needs. The relationship conflict becomes a mirror for internal spiritual dynamics. The career crisis becomes an invitation to realign with authentic spiritual purpose. Jung's work with mandala circular symbols, representing psychological and spiritual wholeness, provides a powerful tool for integrating pain's spiritual meaning. Creating mandalas during difficult periods allows unconscious spiritual wisdom to express itself through symbolic form, often revealing meanings and possibilities that rational thought cannot access. The mandala becomes a container for holding spiritual pain while allowing its transformative potential to emerge naturally. The practice of mandala creation during spiritual crisis serves multiple functions. It provides a safe space for expressing difficult emotions without being overwhelmed by them. It connects personal pain to universal spiritual symbols that have guided human development for centuries. It allows the creative unconscious to participate in the healing process, often producing insights and perspectives that conscious effort cannot achieve. Contemporary neuroscience has begun to validate Jung's insights about pain's potential for facilitating spiritual development. Research shows that certain types of psychological suffering activate brain networks associated with meaning-making, transcendence, and what researchers call self-transcendent experiences. The pain that feels purely destructive on the experiential level often facilitates neural changes that enhance capacity for spiritual awareness and connection. This doesn't mean that all pain is beneficial, or that suffering should be sought for its own sake. Rather, it confirms Jung's insight that pain, when approached with proper understanding and support, contains genuine potential for facilitating spiritual transformation that might not occur through more comfortable circumstances. The spiritual meaning of pain ultimately points toward what Jung called the conjunctio, the sacred marriage between conscious and unconscious, human and divine, temporal and eternal. This union cannot be achieved through force or technique, but emerges naturally through the conscious integration of all aspects of experience, including those that feel most painful and threatening to the ego. The path toward this spiritual union requires what Jung called holding the tension, maintaining awareness and compassion in the midst of spiritual crisis without rushing toward premature resolution or false comfort. This capacity to remain present with spiritual pain while maintaining faith in its ultimate meaning becomes itself a form of spiritual practice that gradually transforms suffering into wisdom. For anyone who recognizes their own spiritual struggles in this exploration of pain's hidden meaning, Jung's message is ultimately one of profound hope and spiritual empowerment. The inner pain you've been experiencing isn't evidence of spiritual failure or inadequacy. It's evidence that your soul is calling you toward levels of spiritual development that comfortable, unconscious living cannot provide. The anxiety, depression, loneliness, existential crisis, and spiritual darkness that feel so overwhelming are actually symptoms of spiritual health, symptoms that indicate your consciousness is expanding beyond its previous limitations and seeking authentic connection with transcendent reality. Understanding this transforms your relationship with suffering from resistance to collaboration with the deepest spiritual processes of your being. The path forward involves developing what Jung called religious attitude toward your own experience, a stance of reverence and curiosity toward the spiritual meaning hidden within even your most difficult moments. This doesn't mean passive acceptance of harmful circumstances, but rather recognition that every experience, however painful, carries potential for spiritual learning and growth when approached with consciousness and courage. Your inner pain has been waiting for this recognition, waiting for you to understand that it carries messages from the deepest and wisest parts of your being. It's been attempting to guide you toward the spiritual realization that your soul has been seeking, using the only language that can penetrate the defenses of ordinary consciousness, the language of suffering that demands attention and refuses to be ignored. Remember Jung's fundamental insight. What feels like your greatest weakness often contains your greatest spiritual strength. What appears to be pure destruction often conceals creative transformation. What seems like evidence of being abandoned by the sacred often signals that you're being prepared for more authentic spiritual connection than you've ever experienced. The secret spiritual meaning of your inner pain is that it's not random suffering or evidence of cosmic cruelty. It's the sacred process of spiritual birth, the labor pains of the soul giving birth to new levels of consciousness, compassion, and authentic connection with the mystery of existence itself. Your pain is holy because it serves the holiest purpose possible, the realization of who you truly are beyond all limited identities and false spiritual assumptions. Trust that every moment of genuine spiritual suffering is also a moment of genuine spiritual opportunity. Your willingness to find meaning in pain, to listen to its wisdom, and to allow it to transform you into who you're meant to become is perhaps the most sacred act a human being can perform. Through this conscious engagement with suffering, you don't just heal your own spiritual wounds, you contribute to the healing of the collective spiritual crisis that touches all human life.